Lori Shepard needs no introduction.
All right, that's great. All right, so I am speaking this afternoon with thanks, as everyone has said. And I should also just acknowledge that I said yes, crazily, because of who else was in the room. So it's great to be here speaking to all of you. Thank you. And my topic is different from the other topics throughout the 2 days, because I'm talking about the kind of assessment that goes on in classrooms to support teaching and learning. And I specifically include both formative and summative assessment, the kind of assessment that's used in the midst of instruction to forward learning, and also the kinds of assessments that are used by teachers to award grades. I was more intimidated than even by the word count, by the fact that I had to do all this in 18 minutes. So I thought I would wave my hands a bit and say, there are these 3 big chunks to the paper, and the heart of it is to provide a research-informed model for classroom assessment. And because I'm trying to do quite a bit of integration of different literatures from math, science, and literacy research on learning, from the learning sciences, from adaptive teaching, et cetera, I feel like I'm working very hard to bring this all together into this model. But felt the need before that to have some historical context, and then wrap it up really quickly with policy implications. So this historical context of one slide tell you all about the whole section. So I'll take a breath and see if I can't get you to buy into this. It's not meant to be a paper about the effects of standardized testing on teaching and learning, but a lot of what people did to get to these literatures that I'm going to be citing that inform a classroom-based model were against the effects that had been felt in the previous decades, and a characterization of understanding what happens from standardized testing in high-stakes contexts. In another paper long ago, I wrote about what we need to understand about the formats of standardized tests, and that at one time, multiple choice tests captured all of learning goals. 100 years ago, that's pretty much what learning looked like. And in longer papers, lots of examples of the skill-based, memory-based ways of representing learning. I know, and Ms. Levy is here, that there are very good ways that we can use multiple choice test items to assess higher order thinking, if we're really good at it, and especially if we have a more curricularly grounded way of representing teaching and learning. But teachers aren't good at imitating multiple choice tests and having those tasks assess higher levels. So we have to worry about the effects that these formats have had over decades in how people infer what learning is about. There's plenty of research on the curricular distortions that have occurred because of high-stakes testing. What most people acknowledge is that math and reading get emphasized to the exclusion of science and social studies. The one idea that I would emphasize for this audience is that even how reading and math are construed has been reshaped by too much focus on the formats of multiple choice tests, and that is differential across schools in ways that matter. These 2 points are kind of, the last 2 points here, a way that I have tried to put a lot of relevant background literature into the paper. And I just note it is interesting that after a couple of decades of research on the effects of high-stakes testing, in the US, the main response was tried to fix that by having better tests to teach to, and to try to work out better representations of the content, primarily through, this morning portfolios were represented, but different ways of using performance assessments to try to get at the problem of distortion caused by the formats of assessments. And it was quite instructive for me to learn more from our European colleagues. In their approach was to look at the learning research and the motivational research and to think differently about the process of assessment and the messages about what learning is for. So I'm waving my hands here trying to give you all of what the research on formative assessment was like, borrowing a lot from the psychological literature because it was a synthesis drawing together quite a number of studies, especially the studies on feedback that showed both positive and negative effects of feedback. But when the feedback was about the features of the task and how to get better at it, you could substantially increase learning. So big body of research that I'm giving you there in a nutshell. So here's several slides to do the heart of the paper to get at the this research-informed model, what I'm proposing or pulling together about what should go on in classrooms. And every one of these syntheses that I'll be citing here, I'm using the NRC report, Taking Science to School. We've changed based on our studies of learning what our goals are. Not just because business leaders suddenly decided they wanted more critical thinking, but because there was lots of research evidence about what it meant to know. And I even think that your title about usable knowledge, it comes from the fact that people like Jim and Michael go around talking about what it means to know means that your knowledge is usable. And I think maybe that's where some of that terminology comes from. Learning progressions are one example in the measurement-informed research that is an example of how we could not just represent endpoints of learning, but also have a cognitive science and an understanding of the ways one gets to those endpoints. And that's what you'll see a lot, probably because Jim Pellegrino authored them all, different allusions to the models of learning that underpin our understandings, not just outcomes, but ways of getting there is what that language means when we call for a model of learning. Citing again Jim Pellegrino, this is a different NRC report. I felt like instead of that I would have more authority if I just kept citing different NRC panels because, and also it does help you with the word limit, I must say. If you just say, well, and I had to resort to this 2012 publication. I think your title was terrible because this is really what everyone in the field refers to as the deep learning report, right? And so if what you're interested in is getting to deep learning, then we have to have an appreciation for sociocultural theory, understanding what it means to have instructional practices where there's a participatory understanding of what it means to know, where we don't have cognition over here and motivation over there, but that who I am as a learner is part of everything I do to get better at something, to be able to contribute more. It's how I talk, it's how I am. And these understandings about what learning is have really changed what our aspirations are for good instructional practices. So there are particular things about how we do that, and the positive feedback studies, very different from the negative feedback studies, do have this way of supporting what it means to move forward. So the assessment part of these understandings is integral right? I'm not telling you the assessment theory. I'm telling you the learning theory of which these assessment practices can be a part. Here I'm citing both the Knowing What Students Know and the 2012 report, the Deeper Learning Report, if you will, and I'm arguing that any model we have for classroom teaching and learning has to have this sociocultural approach that brings who the kids are into the classroom, that has an equitable understanding of what it means to participate, that has to bring coherence, for heaven's sakes, between how we do formative assessment and grading. This is not true typically in classrooms. Even where people are trying to take on the formative thing, today in classrooms what's happening is that purchased commercial dashboards are turning everyone into point systems, which is absolutely antithetical to everything we know about what it means to support intrinsic motivation, what it means to want to learn. And instead, we're holding out carrots that are these points and doing everything we know that's consistent with extrinsic ways of motivating, in quotes, learning and participation. So when I was trying to work out my model, I actually disagreed in this one case with something that the NRC 2012 Deeper Learning Report cited. They're borrowing from Joan Herman's work here. I don't disagree with the spirit of what's discussed. An important element of the Deeper Learning Report is the fact that they call out both cognition, intrapersonal and interpersonal capabilities as being entwined in learning. So very much a sociocultural perspective. I agree with that. I didn't like this model because, let me describe to you, because you can't see the fine print very well. They're showing the growth, which I will show you in the adapted version that I'm coming next. They, however, make too big a place for benchmark assessments. So the one sort of defiant thing that I do in my written report is to argue against the version of coherence that makes a place for vertical coherence toward the outcome measures if those outcome measures are not faithful renditions of what we want kids to know. So I'll show you in 2 more slides my alternative version of this, but I want you to see that I'm disagreeing with parts of what they show here. So this research-informed model for classroom assessment, I'm arguing that instead of making it cohere with the state assessment, and for sure not with benchmark assessments, what if we made it cohere with disciplinary practices, with research on ambitious teaching, and a whole set of other literature where people are working very hard to say, what does it mean to bring discourse-based practices that we know enhance thinking, bring those practices into the classroom? Lots of people are doing that. Why are they doing it completely separately from learning about formative assessment? These tend to be different professional development things that are brought into schools, creating incoherence, I think, for teachers. We could make it all more coherent for students and for teachers if we had one set of efforts with curricular resources, and having already acknowledged one of my many-time collaborators, I should also point to Bill Penuel, who's taught me everything I know about learning theory. And it's this way of creating material resources that we've argued about in others of our papers, that you can't ask people to do this kind of integrative work without professional development and resources. At least the first couple of times you try this stuff, somebody else you have had to work it out. And then I learn how to generalize it after I've had some support to do it a few times. So this is the model I'm proposing alternatively, and it's lots going on there. So I wanted to save a couple of minutes to be able to actually talk it through. So from left to right, I show, borrowing from the NRC report, these three big categories, and I've used a learning progression approach from left to right to show that these things are growing and that they are absolutely entwined. They aren't each of them separately. This is really important. I can't believe that people are out there and they've suddenly said that socio-emotional learning is important, so they're going to go measure it separately. They're going to import treatments to do that separately. That's not what it means in research. We have known about growth mindset since the 1980s. People are just now discovering it, and they're bringing it in as a standalone intervention. That's not understanding how it could be a part of how you learn mathematics. If your family's use of cultural tools was represented, it would be very personal that you got to make a share in the conversation in the math class. The other important change that I've made, though, is I've only put the summative grading box on the cognitive circle, because you can't measure those other things to give grades, for heaven's sakes. And please don't tell me it's ever going to be a part of your state assessment. So I think over dinner, per Michael's advice, we can argue about different parts of this picture. But I think it's worth talking through what it is that we think we can actually do and support in classrooms. A separate part of the paper talks about what we know about research on teacher learning. And here I'm quoting from Darling Hammond, from actually Knapp, who was mentioned previously, and from Hilda Borko's work with Putnam. There's a well-known literature about the kind of support. The material resources is one. It needs to be sustained, it needs to be collaborative, and it needs to be tried out in practice. You don't just go learn about it and then take it home. You need the support on an ongoing basis as you try out these things. And the kinds of discipline-based materials could support both teacher learning and they, in turn, student learning. So, lastly, the policy implications are that formative assessment and disciplinary core practices together support deep learning, that we don't need separate interventions, that self-regulation that is deeply a part of the theory of formative assessment can be how we handle motivation at the same time we're attending to cognitive development. One of the papers that Bill and I did together argued that because of local control, and governance issues were mentioned earlier today, that it's not the state, but local districts who could most likely do the curricular development that makes possible the formative and grading practices that would be healthy. An aside that I have to make, just because this is a pet peeve, that another dinner conversation, database decision-making and interim tests are not instances, and there's recent research that shows how much we have to worry about database decision-making not serving equity processes. I cite the Spencer-funded studies in that regard that have very recently been published. So, Thank you. Looking forward to Rich's comments. He was one of the reasons I was willing to come.
Try not to disappoint. Let's see here. Oh, can I get, yeah,
Oh,
thanks.
I just sat down without you. Sorry. X in the corner. Sorry. Just, thank you.
Totally. That was great, Lori. Thank you.
Just pull mine up.
Wait, did I turn back on?
No,
that is
that's
the
me. Yeah, that's just to remind me. Okay, well, I enjoyed reading the chapter. It's not often that I get to embrace a fellow traveler, and I said, wow, this is exactly how we should be thinking. So my role as a critic will have to be somewhat subdued. So I'd just like to suggest some ways of maybe complicating the picture just a little bit. So I was called to mind a piece by Ted Porter on thicker and thinner descriptions and their long history in the social and natural sciences. And I was particularly recalled as I was looking at the magnitude of this challenge of the labor of Sisyphus. And that when we conduct this kind of work, there are usually countercurrents as we conduct it, pulling us away toward more accountability, more surface level descriptions. But nevertheless, I think we need to persist. So one of the centerpieces here, as Laurie's pointed out, is this idea of linking prospective pathways of student development of ideas in whatever discipline, along with ideas about how to support these forms of development. And you start out taking a coherent model as the centerpiece. So that means you have a way of guiding work with professional communities and guiding forms of assessment that will be productive for classroom learning. There's certainly a premium on denser observation of student learning in classrooms, and there's a wider spectrum of behavior that can inform meaning making, both for students and trying to get a handle through assessment of what it is that they're doing and thinking. I thought the sociocultural perspective is very nice. I thought it might be augmented by a practice view of learning, especially in light of the Common Core and the NGSS. Mm-hmm. So it's just I thought it would be congenial with your argument. Mm-hmm. As you say in your paper, they're hard. And I think it might be worth spending some time thinking about what makes them hard. Well, it takes many iterations of design and systematic variation in settings with collaborating teachers, administrators, community members who are often experiencing pressures to be thin, because they want to go on and take that quick test so they can do the test prep so that they can do better on the statewide assessment, which is, of course, very consequential for many, many students. And there's a broad spectrum of tools that I thought could stand a little bit more fleshing out to support particular instantiations of these things, especially things like high leverage teaching practices. So I'll just give a quick example, just a sacrificial example. So we have a effort to help students in 5th and 6th grades encounter ideas about statistics, visual displays of data, statistics as measures, and modeling chance. So we're trying to help them encounter these ideas. And one of the things that we do is we ask them to measure something. They discover that their measures don't agree. And we ask them to create a display of some kind that communicates something about some pattern that they see. And the intention, of course, is to develop variability and then to exploit the variability with an eye toward problematizing this idea of shape of data. So we try to systematically work with teachers to think about, well, how could we construct productive disciplinary conversations? And the initial kinds of things can be very well informed by the literature on high leverage practice. So we have here eliciting what students are seeing and building collective understandings, and these are kind of standard discourse moves. But when you start to juxtapose different student solutions, this is where it gets to be a bit more difficult. And here, it takes several iterations of design study to figure out what might be more productive discourse moves and less productive discourse moves. So we actually work with teachers and we rehearse these things, and then we track what happens in rehearsal and go into classrooms and look at how the teacher handles that conversation, then go back into the rehearsal setting, then go back into the classroom. And we also have then measures of the kinds of interactions that occur in the classroom. So we need some kind of measure of the qualities of these high leverage teaching practices if we're going to have them work productively to advance learning. The other big opportunity, of course, is a wider spectrum of evidence. So on the left, this is from a project we have introducing K through 5 children to ideas about measure. That's part of a video, and the video is taken by a first grader of another first grader who's using a standard of measure, teacher's foot, to try to measure a length. And they video this with an iPad, and then they post it and make some comments. So on the right is just a little further downstream, in which they fracture measures, and they are trying to use the unit fractions to develop measures, and there's 2 different counting schemes at work. And the teacher has got a little, she's noting that the intervals in one of the rulers, these are, I should have said, these are all measured in the same unit. These are wolves. I don't know where that came from, but that was in this classroom. But again, the teacher is highlighting a point for further conversation. But going back to the video on the left, well, I'm not going to show the video, but here's a student's reflections. Now, I have to say I cleaned up the invented spelling, because unless you're used to it, you might not penetrate it. This student realizes that, hey, you know, when I did this, did a very clever thing. I used this marker, but I put it right on the length that I was trying to measure. So in fact, there's space that I didn't measure. So in other words, I left some gaps. And then another student pitches in and says, yeah, and also you don't want to overlap either, although he's less explanatory about, so what's the problem with that? But then the teacher says, you know, she makes this comment. And I think these are the seeds of what Lori was talking about with student identity. Okay, so we're developing the idea that we have a grasp on something, that other people can benefit from that grasp, and that we pursue it. It's just little steps, but I think it's the little steps that matter. They accumulate. So I was just going to suggest that, in all of these, there's a problem of grain size. So this is some collaborative work with Mark Wilson. What's a productive description of the steps in student learning, in addition to how you might support it? And so we use ideas of progress variables as interpretive frameworks, but they're also great sites for professional conversation. Because as we see something like we just saw in the classroom, what are we going to make of that? What are we going to think of it? And it offers, I think, a way of aligning all these thick descriptions with something that's thinner, but that if we're going to play accountability games, then it seems to me that most of the description should be coming from the classroom. But we'll have to figure out how to create coherent measure, and not from some unspecified statewide test. I mean, I don't even know what half the time is being measured. And I'll just conclude with one other little tool that teachers develop. So if you understand these things about kids learning, well, then assessment's also an opportunity to promote learning. So this is just a little item, and kids just circle what they think has area. And the nice thing is that these are constructed by teachers as guides to how to provoke conversations that will lead to learning. So for example, on the far left, you see that line segment, and you might all circle, you wouldn't circle it, but some of the kids do. And of course, they're absolutely right. As a mark on paper, it has area. And they get up and show you with a document camera that it has area. And so this little formative assessment guide is, hey, this is a great opportunity to think about in what sense is a line segment a measure. What is it a representation of? What is it measuring? Or what is it representing? Sorry. And so I think these are the kinds of things that lie behind, and this is the kind of work that has to be done routinely in order to have this union of assessment and learning and professional development. Thank you.
You should stay up here. So.
You can stay up there. So I'm going to kick this off just by reminding people of some of the prior work that is relevant to this, which were highlighted in some of the slides, but you should know about that, in fact, one of the reports, Knowing What Students Know, which was a study that was led by Jim Pellegrino and our beloved former colleague, Bob Glazer. As I recall, that originated partly with the idea that because of new evidence and new knowledge about teaching and learning, and in particular about learning, and the advent of technology that would make it possible to actually develop what Bob Glazer kept referring to as better representations of learning than what we had gotten in the past, that was an opportunity to think of a new kind of, I don't know, shotgun wedding between psychometrics and representational cognitive psychology. Now, I'm vulgarizing this. It's the end of the day, so we'll... But I think that book was that happened 17 years ago. And I think what we've got here now is evidence of deepening and even more relevant research that is all about the improvement of measurement that can actually be useful both in understanding learning and hopefully in promoting more of it. So I'm really glad that we have this thing happening here. I want to ask Lori a question about the vertical coherence thing. If I understand right, one of your messages, Lori, is that we should avoid the temptation to try to pursue coherence between the kind of classroom-based formative assessment that you're promoting here, that you're advocating for, and statewide measures of performance achievement that might be used for other purposes or for accountability purposes. So I understand the logic there, because you don't want to, what's the right word? You don't want to pollute the formative assessments taking place in classrooms by forcing a kind of vertical alignment with measures that have a whole different kind of thing. The problem is that some people would argue that's exactly what's been wrong with the way we do accountability. It is that it has not been connected to what we are actually trying to do in classrooms. So is the embedded message there that we should just stop doing the accountability type statewide testing? Or did I, as usual, not completely understand the logic of your model?
Well, I should acknowledge that as recently as papers we've published this year, we have invoked vertical coherence. And in the finer grain version in the written paper, I acknowledge that I'm in favor of vertical coherence, but let's admit it's a highly idealized model. And it would work if you had a state assessment that actually embodied the standards, that had attention to disciplinary practices, not just content strands, et cetera. But so long as you do not have that, it is risky to keep using this language about vertical coherence when what you're doing then is welcoming the interim tests that are, so the state assessment is not good at representing the standards, but in many states it's better than the interim tests that are now being installed to imitate it, both of which are distortions. And the more you keep invoking this vertical coherence language, the more you're shoving down the features of that vertical assessment into the classroom. And I tried to stay quiet. I stayed quiet all the way through Rick's presentation this morning. I did not launch into a huge diatribe about about accountability testing. I really tried to stick with my assignment, which was to think very seriously about what we know about research on teaching and learning. And the more, and I will say, and I don't even think this is antagonistic toward large-scale assessments for data collection. Different question about accountability, but even so, if you're going to have those things, you need to think about what impact they're having on the classroom. So I would say, Rick, that something for you and I to discuss over dinner is I think the 0.08 effect size in that House report that you don't like, but that's not the part you don't like, that's a positive thing I try to talk to our students about all of the time, but that can be true at the same time that the exaggeration of the effects between the most benign instructional practices and the most harmful instructional practices affected by these kinds of teaching the test environments, that can also be true. We could be exacerbating differences between the rich and poor schools, and that's what I'm trying to address when I talk about what would it really look like to take what we know from the learning sciences and actually just have our teacher professional development practices be more supportive of deeper learning and of classroom assessment practices that make that possible.
Well, I don't want to, yeah, so this is, that does get to, I think, one of the big tough nut issues, tough nut questions that we've not really been able to crack, and that is the need to provide evidence to policymakers about the condition of schools and learning, and do so in a way that actually promotes more of the learning that we want and more equity in the opportunities for learning that will then be made available to our very diverse and increasingly diverse population of students. I guess, I mean, just thinking back now to the historical thing, and then I'll be quiet, one of the reasons that NAEP did have that kind of prohibition on more fine-grained, and why NAEP used this invention of the matrix sampling and the sample-based assessment was exactly to try to prevent that forcing down into classrooms of a model of teaching that would lead to improvement in those large-scale scores. So the question is, can we? Who else wants to get in on this? I'm already. Since you were. Yes, you were implicated.
Mine is just a question. I don't understand what distortions mean and what the evidence on distortions are. What do you mean by distortions?
Curricular distortion?
Yeah. You said that having these tests lead to distortions in something, and I'm not quite sure what that means.
Well, I think there's study after study that just gives the pretty basic stuff. Teachers report spending less time on social studies and science, art and music being taken out. So that's one level. There are actually few studies that, I hate to even say that the old studies that Bob, Lynn, and Dan Koretz and I did, it's actually unusual to do that kind of study where we created comparable tests testing the same thing and actually equated them in contexts where they were equally unfamiliar. And then we went into into areas where one of those two tests was taught toward and saw what the drop-off in learning is. And this is in reading and math, teaching to the one version, and we got 1/3 to 1/2 standard deviations dropout because people were teaching to the one version of it and the kids weren't generalizing or transferring. You find those same things actually in your work because that's why we keep using NAEP, and NAEP verifies an effect, but it's smaller than the state test. That's another example of, and I actually didn't like the example as much this morning when this test measures algebra and this other tests do not. I want two math tests to cover the same thing, but seeing actually that the formats of this test is the only reason for the kids being able to transfer or not being able to transfer. That's what I mean by distortion. They don't really know it if they only know it one way.
Just a quick follow-up. I mean, the evidence that is most commonly cited is not the latter, which I understand completely, that you don't want kids learning a form of a test. The evidence is usually that it leads to more attention to math and reading and not to other things. And that's, you call it distortion, I would call that maybe a goal of the whole accountability system, that you want people to in fact respond and teach more math and reading early on. And so distortion has a sort of pejorative term element to it, whereas I would have said that that was a desired outcome.
We should, let me just say.
So dinner is turning into like a multi-year event.
Okay.
But I'm encouraging that, and so this is a very significant question, and maybe it's worthy of at least one course at dinner.
Yeah, on your picture with the 3 bubbles and only the cognitive one was assessment, is that for the use case of like the large-scale testing? Because it seemed like the other ones were being assessed, like in Rich's example too. So I guess one way of thinking about that would be that you might try to have some coherence vertically without expecting that you could have completeness. At least you could make sure that whatever's done large-scale cognitively is not contradicting or opposed to what you're doing. But you also need to realize that up at the larger scale, there are things that you care about that in sort of the more drop-in from the sky context, you can't get direct inference about.
I think in the NRC report, they were actually talking about some culminating outcomes for students, and they weren't going all the way. They didn't say in that adapted model. We can ask Jim about this. It imitates the coherence, vertical coherence from knowing what students know, but it is a model for a student. So I think they're a little agnostic in that picture as to what those 3 bubbles mean at the end. So let me just try to be clear. I think when you're assessing for research purposes, I would want measures of those things, like, for example, of school climate. The danger in an accountability situation where if you think cognitive measures can be corrupted, you haven't seen anything yet with respect to those other two categories. I think it's dangerous to suggest that we would include them as part of accountability indices. But what I was writing about in the paper is about the classroom and trying to make the point that yes, I think teachers should be able to attend to who's participating and who isn't. I think they should learn some things about what they do that invites participation or creates exclusion, but they shouldn't grade it. And that we need to be aware of all of the good things we're doing to support teaching and learning are being undercut by our mandatory grading practices. And the number of principals who are telling teachers that they have to send points and grades home to parents every week. It has to be entered into the data systems. And that means that you're grading things in the midst of learning. Without communicating to kids, I know you're still learning. And by the way, you're finished and done with it, because now you've got your points. The psychology behind what we know about thoughtful instructional practices and the psychology that can be used to analyze what we're mandating are diametrically opposed, and nobody's paying attention to it. So I'm just asking for more coherence between what we're teaching teachers about at our best, discourse practices that support kids' thinking and learning, and then what we're doing with our mandatory regimes.
I think Bob is not quite finished, but
We're talking different things.
okay.
Okay.
Now, we have a list of about 9 things for dinner tonight, and then, of course, there's dinner tomorrow night, too.
I'm sorry.
Question? No.
I really like the way you posed the question about, what would it mean to produce assessment evidence that helps us see what is needed, not only to rank or to show who's failing and who's succeeding. And Lori, when you're presenting it, reminded me of a time I visited a school early on in LCB, NCLB requirements and state level testing. And I visited a relatively privileged school outside Seattle. There was just this beautiful 5th grade classroom, all kinds of stuff going on, totally student driven, amazing work going on. And I asked the teacher, are you concerned about how your students are going to do on these new tests? And he said, oh, they'll do fine on the tests. That's the last thing I worried about. Which, of course, is not what you're going to hear in a school that now may have a track record of very low performance, and that the incentives in the low-performing schools is to find the shortest path to the better test scores, not necessarily to the much broader image of the kind of learning that they might hope for their kids, just as much as anybody else does for their kids. But that because we don't have assessments that help us see the potential that's in that classroom, and the desire for learning that's in that classroom, we only see what has not happened when students score poorly. We don't see what they could have done. We only see the evidence of where there has been failure. There's all kinds of reasons why it's not in the interest of principals and teachers to take the risks to do the kind of work that you're all encouraging teachers to do. And it's actually, really the only concern that I think about when I see this kind of work, and Rich knows I'm a huge fan of his work, that the schools, it's like John Easton said, right, that the schools that are most in need of powerful interventions are typically the schools that are least prepared to take advantage of those interventions. And that the kind of intensive work with teachers, the kind of reimagining of practice that you guys do so well and promote so effectively is what's probably least accessible to so many of the schools that are least well performing. So I think I'm just restating in a less precise way what you were saying, Laurie, but that's just what resonated for me.
I think that actually I should cite Dick Elmore's work in this regard that talks about what accountability pressure does in under-resourced schools. It just sends people scrambling. It's not the case that they have ways if they're already under threat to take on these more ambitious things. So it's why I think, it's again why I think we're aiming at districts that would take this seriously, because I think an individual school probably can't if the draconian steps are coming too harshly. It does feel like it's where they could provide those resources. States could as well, but because states have to be mindful of local control, we've actually talked about things like replacement units being a way for states to illustrate what it would look like to do this, but not to mandate a September through May curriculum, because then states would get into their own problems. So I think there are ways, if you realize how big the problem is. I think that's what Rich was saying, is if you actually know how much work in partnership, iteratively, over time, it takes to do this learning and development hand in hand, then you have to make space for that size of an effort.
What's our, how are we doing here?
Oh, we're really in terrible shape.
Oh, no. We can take one more question? Anyone from the cognitive psychology side of the house, or should we go here to the policy and history side of the house? Okay.
Laurie, let me ask you a question, which is actually quite different in some ways, but I'm very curious because it's trying to get that critical thinking, and this is at the college level. The concern now is that a lot of places, states, are thinking about finding out what we're doing in college, and they want to know how people think critically, not so much in terms of content, but the ability to think critically, and also how do they think in terms of discipline. And this is being imposed on people. That's why we're so interested. Now, I think of the work of ARUM that has done this study, 2 volumes, of what critical thinking occurs in college. And the answer is, in the first 2 years, almost nothing. And in the next 2 years, not much more. And that's a very upsetting concept. And these are decent schools. They're not the top 10, but they're probably just below it. So given that result, and that's had a lot of impact on policy thinking, the Social Science Research Council is working with a group of disciplines, including history, economics, about 6 disciplines. And they're asking the question, well, what if we ask in college, are people learning how to think like a historian? Are they learning how to think like an economist? Not so much do they understand American history in factual terms, but the process. Now, the difficulty with that is they've started doing it, and I was on the history group. One of the problems is people would like to think that each one of these disciplines has a different way of thinking. And so the question is, what is unique about a historian thinking about something compared to to an economist? And the answer is, there are times when you do economic history, for example, you have a merger, and so you don't really have it, each discipline is separate. A lot of historians like to think that we are unique. You look at political science, you have political scientists who do history and the thinking of it. So here's a situation where we see much more crossing of disciplines, but disciplines thinking that they have some either unique or a largely unique approach that is worth learning. So I'm just curious, what's your reaction to something like that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so let me just sort out that to answer you well, there is more than one question in there. I would ask you to talk at dinner with Jim Pellegrino, because I would say, so remember, I'm a learner about the learning sciences and about cognitive science, and I can name, including Resnick and Pellegrino and others, and Glaser, actually, who tried or are aware in the early days of the cognitive revolution, thought there were generic skills. And so I'm giving a simplified summary, but basically, you don't learn generalized skills, or it's impossible to study what generalized skills you have if we don't also embed it in disciplinary knowledge, because those things grow together. And if I want to assess your capacity as a historical reasoner, I have to give you historical stuff along with asking you questions that challenge your reasoning capabilities in that discipline. As to like what I would say about this effort at the college level, I would say that to do a classroom learning version of disciplinary knowledge, I would point to what has been going on, and there is an NRC report about this, in discipline-based education research in the sciences. So the physics learning and geosciences learning and chemistry learning has been taken up very seriously, and a lot of what we know about discourse-based instructional practices has been tried in the colleges in those sciences more than it has been in other disciplines, maybe that were more discussion-based in the first place. But if we're going to try to learn from that, I would encourage people to do research studies of it first before they try to install an accountability-based assessment program at the university level. Please, let's learn some lessons and not try that.
Well, this is supposed to be preemptive because people are quite willing to draw these things up in state legislatures. And you would think that at least they would get some advice somewhere beyond the legislators.
Right, well, that's another seminar we're going to do on transmitting research-based knowledge to legislators. Talk about a dinner conversation.